Medieval torture device, thumbscrews. Torture during the Middle Ages was as creative as it was gruesome. However, the popular use of torture in medieval court trials did not grow into its own until the unprecedented legal reforms of the 12th and 13th centuries. Prior to these reforms, in classical and early medieval societies, it was the possession of citizenship that afforded a great deal of protection to the average inhabitant of a kingdom or city. Only in very rare circumstances, such as suspicions of high treason or knowledge of probable guilt in a serious crime, were citizens stripped of their immunity to torture and exposed to its devices. Slaves, prisoners of war, or foreign visitors, on the other hand, were not afforded the luxury of protection that came with citizenship. The legal reforms that signaled an escalation in torture were first implemented into Italian civil law following an in-depth study and modern application of Roman-era law doctrines. The revised adoption of Roman law in Italy rapidly grew in popularity, spreading its roots throughout Middle-Age continental Europe so as to implement a near-universal medieval legal code. The consequence of its popularity, however, was Roman law's unusually high demand for proof in legal proceedings. For an accused individual to have been found guilty, medieval judges or magistrates were required to procure a full confession or the testimony of two trustworthy eyewitnesses. As a result, it could often occur that while much circumstantial evidence suggested guilt, an accused individual could walk free if there was a failure to provide adequate eyewitnesses on the side of the prosecutors. Therefore, from the 12th century onwards, the use of torture began to witness an exponential growth in the persecution of criminals, even before it was officially declared legal. Where guilt seemed probable to a judge, torture was often authorized as a means of extracting a confession. An individual's track record was also taken into account for the decision to authorize torture, as some repeat offenders were no doubt known to local officials. One of the most notorious medieval torture devices was the thumbscrews, also known as thumbkins. Thumbscrews consisted of 3 metal poles, one or more of which was threaded, sitting vertically on a vice-like device. Along these poles, a plate or slab of metal or wood was placed horizontally, with the ability to be slid up and down the poles. The victim's fingers would then be placed in between the plate and the bottom of the device. Presently, the plate would be brought down on top of the victim's digits. Screws, as they were known, which often consisted of basic wingnut designs, would be twisted down along the threads until the wood or metal plate crushed the bones of the victim's fingers, usually both of their thumbs. If the tormentor was especially cruel, additional spikes would be added to the thumbscrew so that as the victim's fingers were being crushed, spikes or nails would be pressed through their nails and skin. The intense trauma that was placed on the fingers would also result in the victim's arms swelling painfully. Depending on how well the victim held up to their torture, their big toes would sometimes be crushed in the same manner. Thumbscrews were considered one of the most effective torture devices of the Middle Ages, as victims were not inclined to die from the suffering, but experienced excruciating pain, finger by finger, bone by bone. Thumbscrews were among the torture devices of choice for Spanish inquisitors during the infamous Spanish Inquisition, which began in the 15th century and did not reach its conclusion in an official capacity until the early 19th century. Torture was used during the Inquisition to force heretics to confess to their sinful beliefs. Torture methods included starvation, burning, the rack, and thumbscrews. Thumbscrews would often be used in conjunction with other torture devices to inflict as much pain as possible. While some of the victims of the Inquisitors would confess and be offered penance and forgiveness for their sins if they accepted true Christian beliefs, others were not so lucky. Many of the victims of both the Spanish and Roman Inquisitions, after confessing, did not agree to give up their heretical beliefs and were condemned to be burned at the stake. Arguably, the most famous individual to have been under the scrutiny of the Inquisitors was Galileo Galilei, a prominent astronomer. Galileo was interrogated during the Roman Inquisition in 1633, and when he was threatened with torture, possibly with the popular thumbscrew device, he admitted his heresy of supporting heliocentrism, the Copernican theory that the Earth revolved around the Sun. While Galileo was not subjected to torture, he was placed under house arrest for the rest of his life. During the late medieval and early modern periods, thumbscrews were used in the torture of those suspected of witchcraft. Thumbscrews tended to be the first torture device used in witch trials because they were so effective in compelling a confession. However, as the terror and pandemonium of witchcraft spread throughout Europe, persecutors began to question whether the confessions and further accusations that were being gathered were actually truthful or just brought on due to the large amounts of distress the victims were under during interrogation. In late medieval and early modern Scotland, torture could only be used if allowed by a legal warrant which was issued by the Privy Council. These warrants also legalized a frenzy of vicious witch hunts that gripped Scotland in the late 16th century. The use of thumbscrews became so famous in Scotland that Sir Walter Scott, prominent author of Ivanhoe, even had a pair in his possession. The use of torture, such as thumbscrews, in witch trials was less common in later England and Germany, among other territories, due to the skepticism of the authenticity of their confessions. Thumbscrews continued to be used into the 18th century, having been applied as a means of punishment on slave ships for uprisings as well as punishment for soldiers in the Russian army who refused to follow orders.